So I'm here with Jason Lengstorf. And Jason, welcome. Thanks for taking some time to chat with me here.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. You are working at Netlify. Is that correct right now? That's your current job?
That's correct. I'm a developer experience engineer over there.
Developer experience engineer. Very good. And you work a lot with the Jamstack, as I think you
hmm
have been for a while. You were previously at Gatsby.
hmm
And so you've been in this Jamstack world for a while. And I've heard some interviews you've given before, some chats you've had about some of the considerations around security, maybe some of the benefits to using Jamstack apps
hmm
as it pertains to security. So wondering about your thoughts there. Maybe where we could start is what is the benefit if you're doing a Jamstack application security-wise that you might otherwise not have if you're doing just kind of a typical single-page app with React?
Sure. So one of the biggest benefits of using the Jamstack approach is that you're building everything ahead of time. So you've got a build step that is going to source all the data and then compile that down into static assets. And once you ship a static asset, there's no longer a live connection to the database or to a server. It's just files on a CDN, which means that the attack vectors that something like, say, a PHP app that's got to have a server, that's got an active MySQL database connection, those sorts of security concerns kind of evaporate because you're no longer exposing your local database to the web. Like to put this into perspective, one way that you can build a Jamstack site is you can run your database on your local machine, start that local server, build the Jamstack site, and then shut that server down so the database isn't available anywhere. And the Jamstack site still works. So you can be really, really security conscious in terms of what's exposed to the web by honestly never exposing some of your databases to the web.
Right.
The other benefit that you get is because they are static assets, they are the result of the code, not the code itself. So if somebody hacks your site, they're defacing built assets. They're not accessing the source code itself, which means that all you have to do to overcome that hack is rebuild the site and redeploy.
Hmm.
So it gives you a lot of benefits in that sense of just kind of peace of mind. Another benefit that you get is because each site deployment is kind of atomic, because you're building out to you're creating like a folder full of static assets. Then if you do notice that something got hacked, you can just roll back to a previous deploy. And that's something that we talk a lot about at Netlify, but it's kind of true of any Jamstack style deployment. Is each version of your site is a built folder.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have an issue, you just redeploy the last successful folder,
Mm-hmm.
and the site goes live again, and it's fine.
That's really cool. One concern, I suppose, that might come up for some people, and something that I've been thinking about a lot too, is you build things ahead of time with the Jamstack application, but what
hmm
happens if you're trying to serve an app that really requires some dynamic interaction, where maybe you've got data coming back that is particular to a user? How do we
hmm
deal with this concept of a logged in user in a Jamstack application and then fetch data for them that is particular to that user?
There are a lot of ways that you can do that. The way that I tend to prefer is using serverless functions.
Okay.
So when you use an OAuth workflow and you end up getting a JSON web token for a given user, you can add roles, permissions. You've got their actual identity. So then you can send off that JWT to a serverless function, and that gets decoded. And you can basically say like, hey, I'm going to make a request to this database. Let me pull the user's ID out of the
Hmm.
JWT and make a request to the database. And that the serverless function has abstracted away all of the sensitive code,
Hmm.
because it's basically like hitting an API endpoint, right? There's nothing that I can
Right.
do to affect the behavior except pass it arguments. So I give it the JWT and I say, give me all of my posts.
Hmm.
And the serverless function says, okay, I found user ID 123 in the JWT. So I'm going to make a request to the database for all posts by this user. Um, JWTs are fairly well documented, and like, I mean, I feel like everything in security is a little bit tough. Like, that's why I think it's so great that you're making a course on this,
Hmm.
is that when you start thinking about that idea of like roles and authentication, and it just gets a little headbendy, right?
Hmm.
But I found that JSON web tokens tend to be fairly understandable. Like,
Hmm.
at least, you can drop them into something like jwt.io, and you can see what's inside of them, and see the roles and things like that. And then once you add that secret, they're not really like, you can't mess with them anymore. And so that ends up being really nice. So like if I'm building an app, I've got my user token, but I can also add a role of like editor. And if I'm an editor, then I have the ability to like use the create, read, and update features, but I can't use delete. Like if I send a request to a delete endpoint, it'll detect that I don't have that privilege and it'll just fail. It'll send back a 401 or whatever. But if I have the administrator role, then I can add that privilege. So it's all kind of like buried inside of these different like access permissions like that. But in the Jamstack, you can do that through just a regular asynchronous call. If you've got the JSON web token, you can just pass that off and hit something directly. I prefer to wrap that up in a serverless function because it helps me protect things like a server token that says I'm authorized to make that call in the first place. So it's kind of like two different keys that say that I'm allowed to do what I'm supposed to be doing. Mm-hmm. And it never puts a direct link to the database, which a client side request would be doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. What's the model, I suppose, for like, well, let's maybe think about Netlify functions as a way to do these kind of serverless functions, these calls that you might make from your Jamstack or React app. What does it look like if you want to say maybe if we're thinking back to just like a typical Express API that's got certain routes that are public, certain routes that are private, then certain routes that are scoped to particular roles or whatever. Mm-hmm. What should developers be thinking about when they go to translate that to serverless functions, especially, I guess, on Netlify? Like, is there any particular dance that needs to be done with a Netlify function? Do you have to like kind of do some kind of pre-flight thing with them, anything like that?
Not particularly. Depending on what you're using for your JSON web tokens, like if you use Netlify Identity, which is a kind of a companion offering to the Netlify functions, then we'll automatically decode that JSON web token and like put it into a context argument, so you can pull out the user and the roles and all that stuff.
Okay.
But in terms of like, there are probably open source libraries that work in Express that will work in serverless functions. Under the hood, basically, we're using AWS Lambda. So there's an Express Lambda server. Like, you can run Express as a Node app in a serverless environment. So really, you could just port your entire Node server over and use it on a serverless function. That's probably not the best solution, but it could be a great on-ramp into getting up and running. But a lot of that middleware, if you want to do CORS protection, you want to make sure that it's coming from an allowed origin, or you want to do pre-flight, like validating that the JSON web token has the right signing key and stuff. All of those same libraries that would use, like the JWKS, the like secret authorization and all that stuff, those still work. So you would just use that same workflow that you would use in a lot of Node apps. To validate that the authentication is what it is, that the request came from where it came from. I tend to check headers and make sure that like this function was hit using the appropriate header. So if it's not a put, then I reject it. Or if it's, you can also set it up to do, multiple. So here's my serverless function, check for if it's post, do this. If it's get, do this. So you can kind of set it up very similarly to what you would do in an Express app. The way that I've oversimplified this is I think about serverless functions as being, if you took your whole Express app and then you just scoped it down to just what one route does, like when you do like, app.get and then a route name, the code inside of that function, that's what you're writing in a serverless function. The rest of the infrastructure, setting up the port that you're listening on, all of that kind of pre-flight stuff, you don't have to write that. And then you can just add middleware at the beginning of the request if you need it, to validate headers, to validate tokens, to validate identity, whatever you want to do.
Okay. Gotcha. That makes sense. And I suppose, like, if you're thinking about tying another identity provider in, or maybe your own sort of bespoke authorization server where you're minting tokens yourself, but then you want to call Netlify, a Netlify function. Is there this ability to have like a shared secret to validate tokens against? Like you might sign a token on your end with a secret key, and then you would use that same secret to validate against on Netlify?
So it depends on how you're doing it. Like I don't think without a pro account you can change the JSON web token secret.
Okay.
But you can set environment variables that that are accessible inside the function. So if you wanted to put some kind of a shared secret that went across all of your properties,
Right.
you could definitely do that, and it wouldn't be like a paid feature. Even you could do it on the free tier.
Right.
So yeah, there are a lot of options for that sort of thing. I've implemented a small app that uses a I think it's called a UUID key, where it like generates what looks like a serial number and then a hash string, and those are like your API key and API secret.
Okay.
And I keep the secret on the back end of the apps, and I use that token as like my client signing key to validate that a thing has the permission to do what it's supposed to do, and that tends to be pretty effective.
Okay. That's cool.
Yeah, there's lots of options there.
Nice. So thinking back maybe to Gatsby, especially, is there anything inherently different about a Gatsby app? I guess it would extend to Jamstack apps as a whole, but maybe thinking about Gatsby in particular, that is tricky when it comes to dealing with authentication, maybe dealing with the concept of a logged in user, dealing with presenting a view, rendering something that should just be rendered to a certain user that's logged in, maybe a certain user that has an access level that would be a little bit different in that world compared to typical Create React app. Anything you've run into?
Not anything super intense. I mean, the biggest thing that you have to be mindful of when you're dealing with Gatsby or any Jamstack site is that you are pre-rendering content, right? And so that means that things that you might just ship as a Create React app, you have to kind of think about like, okay, which part of this gets rendered ahead of time and which part of this needs to get loaded asynchronously once we have user information. So there are a couple considerations like that in making sure that you're like with a Gatsby site, you need to make sure that you wrap any requests to authenticated stuff. That you have to wrap any request to authenticated stuff in a like a use effect or some other kind of asynchronous handler, so that the Gatsby build doesn't try to make those calls before it has valid tokens.
Right.
But those are more like, how do you handle asynchronous versus like prepared data in server-side rendering? And so it's sort of related to auth, but not like specific to auth.
Gotcha. Yeah. I think I saw that one sort of technique for thinking about like a Next.js application is that you can sort of have you can, because you're constructing things ahead of time, you construct your views and those would be shipped to production, but they would have like holes, as it were, that need to be filled in by data that is fetched at runtime when the user is logged in, right? But you could still, as a non-logged in user, you could still kind of make your way to that view that's full of holes, right?
Right.
And this is something that I often kind of go back and forth about with different people, is like whether or not it's a big deal to be able to see portions of the application that shouldn't be seen by non-logged in users. And I'm kind of the opinion that, if a user, because everything in the front end is like basically out of our control anyway, by the time your code bundle hits the browser, you've lost control over like what the user is able to do with it. I'm sort of the opinion that like if like a savvy user is able to find their way to a route or a view that they're not supposed to be at, as long as the data that powers it is hidden away behind a protected API, it's not really a big deal for me if somebody sees that view that is just like a broken sort of hole looking view. I think in this Jamstack world, it's almost it sounds like it's a necessity to some extent, right?
Well, it's so sort of like one of the things that you can do when you're running a Jamstack app is like you can have a whole route that's just kind of an escape hatch. So for example, like in a Gatsby site, you might have a dashboard route And under dashboard, you by default go to like dashboard login. But then once you've logged in, you're going to be able to see dashboard home, dashboard billing, dashboard account. And you can fully client side render all of those so that somebody can't like really load anything. And if you wanted to go way overboard and like even make sure that somebody couldn't reverse engineer the bundle, you could theoretically make sure that somebody has an active token and like asynchronously load the bundle, which would be, I mean, like, I would probably personally never do that. That seems like a long way to go to let somebody not see an app skeleton.
I did run into that recently. I was chatting with someone on Twitter about that. And what was the situation? They were working for a company that like, they were building a React app and they had to ship certain code bundles. It was like some kind of thing where you play games in the browser or something. I can't quite remember. But they had to ship certain bundles asynchronously to certain users, depending on their kind of like permissions level and what they've paid for ahead of time, etc. So the idea was they didn't at all want to make it possible to be able to asynchronously load a bundle that they shouldn't have access to. So they did this thing where they like manipulated a Webpack and all of that stuff so that they could check for an authorization token on lazy load, essentially. So as you're lazily loading your client-side bundles, you have to pass auth, which is like a whole, it's what you just talked about, this whole other layer that is probably overkill. But for this company, I guess, you know, it made sense for what they were doing.
Yeah, and it totally makes sense. Like if you're thinking about somebody who's like a big enough company that you have like corporate espionage, you probably do want to do that sort of thing where somebody can't like reverse engineer their way into figuring out what your new premium offering is, even if they can't see the data. But again, that's an edge case. I would reach for that last if I was building an app.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's a little bit overboard for the stuff that I've worked on anyway. I mean, if someone is savvy enough to get to that spot, they're going to know how to do things to, you know, hack their way through the code bundle. But again, for me, it's like, as long as the data is inaccessible, that's really what matters at the end of the day.
Right.
Cool. Well, maybe before we wrap up, I love to ask this to everyone who's concerned with auth. What is your opinion on JSON Web Tokens versus cookies and sessions in this world that we're in? Because this is like a hot debate online, right? You've probably seen articles like this. JSON Web Tokens shouldn't be used ever. You should use cookies and sessions. And then there's the other camp that says JSON Web Tokens are totally fine. Stop complaining. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I haven't worked in anything that was significantly secure enough to merit like concern, really. So I've used JSON Web Tokens because they tend to be, for my use cases at least, they tend to meet my needs. I think like cookies and sessions are cool, but the other thing that I always kind of think about when you hit this is like, here we start to step outside of my depth here because I'm not like a deep security expert. But it kind of seems like to use a JSON Web Token, you have to be able to kind of intercept somebody's traffic, which if they're over SSL, you shouldn't ever be able to do. Right. So unless the app is built poorly, you would need the same level of access to their machine to get the JSON Web Token as you would you would need to get like into their browser and see their cookies and sessions. So It kind of seems to me like it's the same amount of security risk. Like, it doesn't seem like, for the average app, it doesn't seem like a big enough advantage using one over the other to worry about it.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely resonate with parts of that. And one of the big concerns with JSON Web Tokens especially is depending on where you keep them in your apps in the browser for the user, they can potentially be lifted if you've got your app susceptible to cross-site scripting and somebody looks into local storage or whatever. But the other point on that I always kind of go to with people is like, you don't want to be building your application knowing that there are cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in place anyway. Like that's something you want to be guarding against regardless of what the mechanism is that you're doing authentication with, right?
Right.
So, it's I look at these these arguments about, JSON Web Tokens versus cookies and sessions, and I tend to, I don't know. I think JSON Web Tokens are totally fine. I think they've been around long enough now in use to great enough extents that it's perhaps proven is not the right word, but it's at least they've got a track record that shows that they can be used securely. There's companies that are built upon them, right? There's companies that employ them for their authorization mechanism. So they're in wide use, and at least my opinion is like, if you have a good use case for them and you want to use them, then go ahead.
Yeah, that's kind of where I've landed as well.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Well, it's been great chatting with you. Thanks for giving me your thoughts on all of the auth stuff related to Jamstack apps. I will, I'll certainly be looking to you for some more info in the future, I'm sure, as I'm looking more towards the Jamstack. Where can people go to find the stuff that you're doing?
The easiest place, I have kind of an aggregate page at jason.af that will link you to all the other things that I do.
Cool. Awesome. I will link that up. All right. Well, thanks so much. Take care, man.
Yeah, thank you.